Good day, everyone. We are from the group 7. We would like to present about the contribution of Islam to development of diplomatic and consular law. However, before we start our presentation, let me introduce our group members. There are Muhammad Dhia Naufal, Nadin Sahasra, Fauzar Rahma, and Auralia Salsabila. Next slide, please. So here's the outline of our presentation today. First, we will have the introduction, and then will be followed by the discussion, and lastly, we will have the conclusion. Next slide, please. So here's the introduction. Well, long before the development of international law, religious law has been dominated diplomatic relations. Based on the historical evidence, human beings in early communities established social relations, cooperation, and interaction between each other by drawing upon their intellect and free will to fulfill their material and spiritual needs. This kind of interaction then developed into simple as well as primitive rules and regulations to control their relations. According to Sadr, diplomatic law is a set of rules which govern international political relations among countries. Based on the fair reading of history, diplomatic and consular law has established from the Orient when the holy prophets appear with the ideas to guide people closer to God. The conventions of diplomatic and consular law are often associated with religion. Moreover, based on the point in the Quran and the tradition of the holy prophet, it will help to have better understanding the contribution of Islam to the establishment and recognition of diplomatic and consular law. Next slide, please. So here's the discussion. First, we will talk about the development of diplomacy in Islam. Since the components and rules in international law is primitive and doesn't evolve consistent with the need of international community, international law failed to reach its goal, including maintain peace and security, as well as international collaborations. According to Big Delhi, the first step to establish diplomatic and consular law is to carry out diplomatic relations. Therefore, it is necessary to study Holy Prophet's diplomacy style since its early days before analyze diplomatic and consular law in the Prophet's age. Next slide, please. Okay, the next subbab is about the development of Islam and start of the negotiation. Back then, when people who live in Central and Western Arab used war to solve a problem, and the concept of negotiation was unknown except for limited situation. However, after the revelation of Quran that God sent to Holy Prophet as his envoy to guide people closer to God, Holy Prophet Muhammad used negotiation methods privately to invite people to Islam. It was stated in the Quran, Surah An-Nam, verse 125, which say that invite all to the way of your Lord with wisdom and kind advice, and only debate with them in the best manner. Surely your Lord alone knows best who has strayed from his way and who is right guided. And the next subbab is about the Islam boycott and beginning to send delegates. After 3 years of private invasions, Prophet Muhammad began to introduce Islam to public, which led Islam to be boycotted by Mecca leaders and sent Muslims into exile. The Prophet then established friendly ties with the countries and tried to get support of the Abbasian rulers to alleviate the problem he faced in Mecca. The Prophet sent several delegates to Abyssinia, which led by Jafar bin Abi Talib. Although the delegates faced several problems, eventually they managed to convince the king to let them live and preach Islam in Abyssinia. The support and protection which Muslims won from Abyssinian king was a step forward for Muslim delegates to enjoy diplomatic protections. Next slide, please. Okay, the next discussion will be delivered by Naufal.
Okay, I will deliver the next discussion. First one is 1.3 development of Islam and the Prophet emphasis on diplomacy. After the returning of Islam, the Prophet decided to go on pil- pilgrimage to Mecca in the year 6 HAH, accompanied by 1,400 disciples. The Prophet left Medina, Medina and asked his companions to lift the swords aside. They put on ihram attire in al-Halifa and tied their sacrifice sheep with ropes so that the Quraysh could make sure they meant pil- pilgrimage but not war. The specific symbolization was used due to lack of relation between Muslims and idolaters. However, the Quraysh prevented their entrance into Mecca and sent delegates to the Prophet and asked him to return to Medina. Afterwards, the Prophet sent an envoy to the Quraysh. However, they abused the envoy and drove him away. Despite this, Uthman bin Affan as another envoy to the Quraysh of the Prophet and kings. The Prophet assigned Uthman as his envoy because he was known for his calmness and tolerance. Uthman went to one of his relatives in Mecca. According to Arab tradition, the landlord was to guarantee the life of the guest. Thus, to gain a diplomacy impunity in Mecca. Then he related the Prophet message to the Quraysh leaders as his diplomatic mission. This prudent diplomacy led to the Treaty of Hudaybiyah and the Prophet's diplomacy that guaranteed the impunity of envoys resulted in a procedure in sending and receiving delegates and envoys. Thereafter, the Quraysh stopped abusing delegates under the Istijar law, which assumed, assumed the protection of refugees. Uthman could finish his mandate. And the next is 1.4 complete victory of Islam in Arabia and establishing ties with powers and empires. After the Mecca conquest by Muslim, Islam was recognized as the only power in Arabia. According to his defined mandate, the Prophet was meant to introduce Islam to other nations. During his 10-year rule, the Prophet took constructive measures in international relations. He sent letters and envoys to other countries and empires, which was a turning point in diplomatic law and relations in Islam. The Muslims followed the model of the Prophet in the coming years so that they emphasized diplomacy as the first step in establishing relations with other nations and considered war as the last resort. Having reviewed the Prophet's active diplomacy, we now address the way he selected and sent the envoys in order to highlight the importance of diplomatic law for him. Uh, Subsequently, we explain the Prophet's treatment of foreign envoys in order to determine the Islamic stance on treating delegates and representatives of other nations. Next slide. Okay, the next is sending and selection of delegates. Some historians have reported that the Prophet sent over 300 letters to the tribe, chief state leaders, and religious authorities. The Prophet preferred to alleviate barriers such as rulers of other states that stood between Islam and the people using diplomatic procedures and rational methods. Sending envoys was thought to be one of the best ways to remove these barriers. Some of the envoys were Ja'far bin Abi Talib to Abyssinia, Imam Ali to Yemen, Karash, and Usman to the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Urwah, Urwah ibnu Mas'ud to Mekah, Abdullah Qadana, Hatib ibnu Abi Balta'ah, Wahab bin Kalbi, and Umar ibnu Umayyah to Abyssinia. Uh, According to Darban Sa'ad, the Prophet sent 6 letters to different countries, including Iran and Rome, in the same day. The Prophet's envoys were welcomed in Egypt, Abyssinia, and Gassan, which indicated that these countries reserved rights for the envoys. In- interest- Interestingly, the envoys could speak the language of the receiving country. It is a very effective technique the Prophet established in Islamic law, and which became customary in Islamic diplomatic and consular law. Some of the prophet envoys were killed during their mandate. Still, the Prophet continued sending envoys even at the price of their martyrdom. The enemy could not stop the Prophet or encourage him to make the reprisal as he accepted enemy envoys respectfully. Arab tribes respected the impunity of political influence as much as they cared about their guests and obeyed it as a tribal tradition and law. However, they tended to violate this law during a war due to prejudices and primitive aggression, so that the Prophet imposed fell victim to blind prejudice and violence. An example of such aggression happened to Haris ibn Amir al-Yudi, who was delegated to deliver the Prophet's message to a ruler of Egypt and Syria. On his way, the envoy arrived in the city of Muta. The city governor Sari Amr-Ghasani arrested him. Having found the envoy was sent by the Prophet, he tortured and killed him. This fate doomed many envoys of the Prophet. However, he didn't stop sending delegates. Rather, he increased the number of delegates so that the repetition resulted in the impunity of envoys even at times of war. Thus, delegates' impunity became an irrevocable custom. And then, when the Prophet sent a large number of delegates and representatives to other countries and tribes, he certainly recognized their rights under the diplomatic and consular law. Otherwise, he would not send them as such. And as it was common among Arab tribes, he would only send them to declare uh, ceasefire or to handle critical situations. Thus, the Prophet recognized certain rights, including respect for the delegates in the host country. He was particularly careful, precise, and cautious in selecting the envoys. He tried to select close envoys as much. Sorry, he tried to select flawless envoys as much as possible. He considered acumen, eloquence, handsomeness, courage, and loyalty as important characteristics of the envoys. Such carefulness not only led to strong diplomacy and good diplomatic outcomes, but also brought about respect for the envoys. This was clearly demonstrated in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Usman never showed inappropriate behavior so that he was not looked upon as an enemy. Okay, the next material will be delivered by my friend.
Okay, thank you, Opal, for the opportunity. So, for my part, it will discuss about the prophet's treatment of the invoice from other states. So, after relief from dealing with the Quraysh tribe, the prophet found an opportunity to increase the negotiation with the invoice from other states and also the tribes. So, from the year 6 AH, delegates from religious sectors, tribes, and states began to throng Medina. And then the delegates were sent to Medina year after year in order to increase the level of negotiations, and their income was also increased as well. So the invoice who came to meet the prophet were called a waft, or Waft has the meaning of delegate body. So the prophet has to make sure that the delegates could live in a welfare and in a proper situation when they were live in Medina, which they can also live side by side with the Muslims in peace and security. So the examples of the Prophet's wives were, for example, Bani Hadramaut, in which of the rulers of the Hadramaut region meet and negotiate with the Prophet. And then the second one, Huzan Waf, who were the delegates that met the Prophet in Jarana when he was returning from Taif. And then the third church tribe, Waf, who led by Asad bin Harte Kalbi, who met the Prophet, and also Al Yamama Waf that include Talq ibn Ali and Talq ibn Qis, which they were negotiated with the Prophet about Al Yamama people in Medina, and so forth and so on. And then in the year of 6 AH, several meetings with the delegates were conducted. And long after the year of 6 AH, in the year 9 AH, the meetings were conducted a lot more than before, which in this year, in 9 AH, the year was even called as al-Wafud, or year of meetings, because the meetings were conducted a lot more than before. Then in the meeting negotiation, they were discussing about the economic aids, research about Islam, signing peace treaty, and the treaty of neutrality. So in all of the negotiations, the Prophet treated the envoys from other tribes with respectfully, of course, and with honor, even though some of the Prophet's envoys were tortured, abused, and killed. But the Prophet treat the opposite envoys with respect and honor. Next slide. And then still the Prophet's treatment of the envoys from other states. So the example of Prophet's treatment of foreign envoys that reflect the diplomacy practice is that the development in diplomatic and consular law was the negotiation between Urwah ibnu Mas'ud and the Prophet. And then in Al-Sair al-Kabir, Shaybani reports that a foreign envoy came to meet the Prophet and spoke disrespectfully while delivering his message to the Prophet. Quote unquote, "If you were not an envoy, I would sentence you to death," it is answered by the Prophet. This indicates that the Prophet's commitment to the diplomatic law developed by the Prophet in 14 centuries ago. So the Prophet observed certain formalities in welcoming the envoys. He dressed in formal attire and formally welcomed the envoys. Also, the envoys were received and stayed in Darul Zayfan, which means a guest house that was protected and safe, which is this practice considered as the example of the impunity of diplomatic and consular accommodation. Apart from that, another example of the reflection regarding to the diplomatic practice is that there was this person called Musailimah who went to Medina in the year of 10 AH, and he was converted to Islam. However, he returned to his hometown. Musailimah, the people in the village, that he was the Prophet. It means that Musailimah claimed himself as the Prophet. Musailimah here is lying about the position of himself. So if the liar Musailimah went to the Prophet himself, the Prophet, of course, he will kill Musailimah or behave differently because Musailimah deserved death. Ibn Far says that the Quraysh sent Ibn Far to the Prophet as their envoy, and when he met the Prophet, Ibn Far met the Prophet, he felt Islam in his heart, and he told the Prophet that he didn't want to go back to the Quraysh. But the Prophet answered that he will not break the pact, meaning that Ibn Far has to get back to Quraysh because he's an envoy. So it means that it's the prophet reflect another practice of diplomacy in his daily bids. So the next part will be delivered by my friend.
So the next part is Quranic stance on diplomatic and consular law. So in this part, it tells that God asked the prophet in Quran to invite people in a good words, indicating appropriate treatments of people. So God asked people in Quran to treat their guests with the best foods, like Abraham the prophet who went to his family and came with a fat roasted whenever he received the guests. And then and the next verse, it's also stated that Quran asserts that the most should move, that the one who come to the house should move to the door and welcome the guest with warmly into the house. And in this verse, teach Muslim how to welcome a guest with respect is the key to welcoming. And then it means that Quran emphasize the respecting the guest as a trivial level of social relations. It should certainly and primarily require the respect for representative and envoys and protection of their rights and impunity. So this because the envoys represent a nation or a state, so that once he is respected or abused, also once he is respected or abused, the whole nation is respected or abused. So and then the Quran requires the prophet to talk to and negotiate with his sworn enemy, and the other experts also interpreted that Quranic teaching consider the impunity for people who comes to Muslim for negotiations, and Quran guarantees the security of polythesis. So the next slide is the stance of International Court of Justice and international law and the contribution of Islam to the consular and diplomatic law. So actually, ICG support that Islam has had an important role in establishing the trends and establishing the trends and procedure of diplomatic law with regard to the Iran hostage crisis in 1979 until 1980. So ICG observed that people with diplomatic mandate should not be abused as a rule that owes much to Islam traditions, stated on ICG report in 1980. So and also it stated in um, in April 1949 that it was asserted in the San Francisco Conference that Islam is one of the independent civilizations addressed by Article 9.3 that Islam is the evidence that to support the contribution of Islam to the international and diplomatic law. So the next part is how does the Muslim lawyer stance on diplomatic and consular. So in Islam is typically considered peace and security as the priorities in establishing relations and always invited toward mutual respect at all levels of social life. Muslim lawyers tend to create procedure in diplomatic law based on Holy Qurans and in Al-Shair ul-Kabir, Shebani writes that the envoys might not carry out their missions unless they are safe. Thus, there are no conditions on their security, and it would be better to ensure security through a written agreement. So Shehbani can be considered as the innovator of an idea that was reflected in the introduction of diplomatic conventions in many years after him. In the introduction of diplomatic conventions, it is observed that the impunity is not granted to benefit the individuals, but helps them to carry out their duties. So, and then in conclusion, Diplomatic and consular law exist to protect the life, person, assets, and secrets of envoys of a given state and the recipient state so that the envoys may best carry out his missions. All diplomatic law is summarized in protecting the representative of center states. The importance of diplomacy was recognized by the Prophet since the beginning of his prophethood. Such diplomacy may be reinforced only when the consular diplomatic law is recognized and foreign state envoys are respected. And then the highest order international tribute that acknowledge the contribution of Islam to the development and evolution of Islamic and consular law. It's recommended that Islamic countries make a treaty and diplomatic and consular law based on Vienna conventions to help elevate the existing law as the contribution of Islam to diplomatic law. So back to the moderator.
Okay, so that's all for our presentation today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask us during the Q&A. Thank you.